I'm more than delighted, actually. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, John Ralston Saul. There's few people in Canada where you can say this man needs no introduction, but I think John Ralston Saul is one of those. He's an award-winning essayist, novelist, a Massey lecturer. His book is available at the bookstall outside. But Mr. Saul's contributions to the world of ideas have gone beyond just the written word. He has challenged us all to question our fundamental assumptions about our country, about the world we find ourselves in. His works have spanned fiction, nonfiction, political commentary, and philosophy. He is also, and this is important to all of us in this room as scholars, a longtime champion of freedom of expression and was re-elected to a second term as president of PEN International in October 2012. His latest book, Dark Diversions, is his fifth novel in English. Today, continuing what's been a whole day of discussion that is very receptive, I think, but also touched on a lot of the themes that John Ralston Saul will also speak on. The title of his talk is A Country Won or Lost by Intellectuals. So it's with very great pleasure that I welcome John Ralston Saul and invite him to take the podium.
Merci, Antonia. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir d'être ici. Et je ne connais pas tout le monde, mais il y a pas mal de gens que je connais dans la salle. Antonia, on a fait des choses ensemble. Charlotte Gray, avec laquelle on a fait les Extraordinary Canadians. Je crois que Justin Letourneau était sur une des jurys, mais il n'est pas là. Mais on a fait une série de conférences, qui est maintenant une des séries de conférences clés au Canada, les conférences La Fontaine-Baldwin. C'est la 11e année cette année. Et ça va être Sean Atnew, le chef national autochtone, au mois d'août. Et donc je me sens, puisque je porte sur mon dos comme une maladie mon doctorat, et puis vos universités m'ont donné 17 autres, je crois, je me sens toujours un peu coupable quand je viens parler devant vous, si je ne dis pas les choses entièrement positives. Mais voilà, c'est comme ça. I thought that your report sounds fascinating. Your comments were fascinating. I think I agreed with what Alex was saying about can you measure the humanities and, for that matter, the social sciences, or should you? And I said to him just beforehand that I would actually go a lot further. I don't think it's simply that the social science and the humanities are much more geographically fractured, which is what you said. They certainly need to be and should be. I'd say they're not fractured enough, which isn't to say that there isn't an important thing to be doing at the international level, but there has to be the sense that original thought and original experiences, indigenous experiences, are happening in different places, and that we are not all still the children of intellectual traditions which come from one or two countries or three countries, maybe four, but actually the way it works out in the end is that if you're in North America, you end up getting it from one tradition in English and one tradition in French, and they're not put together, so that it is... I think you were both using the word world class, which is one of my unfavorite terms. I have to tell you, because of course people at Harvard don't use it because they think they are the world. And people outside of the center, quotes unquote, do use it because they think that would somehow put them in the center, which it doesn't. It simply indicates you're not in the center. So it's a colonial phrase. By its very definition, every time one says world class, you're identified as somebody from the colonies. I've never heard anybody in England say world class, or France, or Germany, but maybe it's the people I hang out with. But what I would say is that there are extremely interesting things happening in different countries which do not have roots referring back to the European university tradition, which our universities are built on. They simply don't refer back to them. And so to the extent that one is going to international meetings where there is, which are dominated usually by people from a small number of countries, with a small number of traditions, to the extent that one's going to those meetings, it's very difficult to see how those other experiences come in and actually change the direction of what is this international agreement of what is measured as good or interesting. And I think this is particularly important for Canada because, there's that terrible cliche in Canada about this is a country that doesn't work in theory but works in practice, right? And of course what that is it doesn't work according to the theory of the European Westphalian nation state. It doesn't therefore work according to theories of European philosophy or political science, which means it doesn't work according to the theories of U.S. philosophy or political science, because it's essentially European theory, right? And so the more that we lock ourselves into those sort of analysis, the harder we make our lives. And in many ways, I think that if our universities were ranked at the top of the social sciences and the humanities internationally, the country would break up. Because you would have succeeded of imposing the monolithic Westphalian European philosophical theory on Canada, which would mean that we'd have a civil war or explode. And I'm not joking. I'm actually not joking. And one of the biggest tests for people in public life in Canada, and you're in public life, in Canada, is to figure out how to get a good education and then go out and run the country and not do what you were taught to do at university. It's helpful. It illustrates something. But if you actually applied it, we'd have had civil wars long ago. And you can actually identify all the darkest moments of Canadian history as moments when we tried to apply world-class international theories of philosophy and political science and history and economics. Those are the moments when the country almost broke up because we did something awful to Chinese, Japanese, French, Canadians, Jews, et cetera, et cetera. We broke the ideas of federalism. None of those international theories are based on our theories of how you hold a country like this together. And it was interesting that Alex mentioned in a complimentary way Martha Nussbaum as speaking truth. I just heard her in Australia a few months ago. She paid probably a fortune, and she was speaking at the Melbourne Festival. And it was fascinating because she stood up and gave a deeply provincial American speech, which she thought was world-class and global. And I watched this audience of highly sophisticated Melbourneites, because Melbourne is a very sophisticated city, freeze in their seats when they realized the extent to which they were being insulted by her, because she had absolutely no idea what the effect of her words were on Australians, who knew a hell of a lot more about the world than she did, because coming from a smaller country, you actually have to know about the world. You can't just come out of Chicago and say some stuff that works in Chicago and you think it's universal, and it isn't. Right? So if that's insulting, I've actually been waiting several months to say that about her. So I thank you. I thank you for giving me that opportunity. So let me take this and I think it's a good follow-on from, and it would be interesting, and I'd love to I didn't stay for the question period, I'm sorry, because I had to do something else. It'd be interesting to talk even about the sciences, because I would be interested to know what you think about, for example, what are the goals of certain fields of science, for example, that deal with the environment, which is the single most important scientific question in the world today, I think without any doubt. So what are the goals of science in Europe, which has a whole other pattern of life, of density, of views of land, where, the philosophical concept of a forest is something which is planted in straight rows over a couple of acres, right? And then is farmed. And so that philosophy of science of the environment as opposed to, what was being done in those lakes in, where is it, western, between Winnipeg and the Lakehead by Professor, help me, Schindler. And, it's interesting that, and this is not politics, it's interesting that Schindler is speaking up very strongly. He's one of the greatest scientists in this country, one of the great scientists in the world, has had an international impact because he started from a theory that had its origins here, and yet I don't hear a lot of support in the academy for this man speaking up. I just don't. Maybe I'm missing it. Maybe scientists are standing up. Am I wrong? I mean, this is where Canada actually broke through and changed the direction of things on the environmental level to some extent. So, but what I really wanted to talk to you about was sort of the next step beyond this conversation, which is to say that if we talk about measurement and we talk about facts and we talk about proof, and we're talking about the social sciences, which aren't science, and in economics, the least among them. I mean, a speculative domain, right, of imagination. If we talk about the social sciences and we talk about the humanities, we have to come up against a moment when we say that, that the way people talk are able to talk, the sentences people put together in universities and in public, citizens, the way they're able to talk about themselves, the language which they are given by you, because you're one of the principal furnishers of language to your civilization and to other civilizations, possibly. This language is of enormous importance. And it's public language. There is no such thing as academic language versus public language. And Tony and I were chatting about this, public intellectual. I mean, there's only one kind of intellectual. And either it stands or it doesn't stand. The question is it well written or badly written? If it's well written, then it stands in the universities and outside of the universities. It's very hard work, but that is the reality of language. And that language is the language which creates stories and mythologies. Now, when people hear mythology, they sort of immediately think vague, romantic, not true. But of course, civilizations live by mythologies, and including the United States, including France, including them, they're entirely constructed on a daily basis on mythologies. That's what gets people through the days, is the way in which they think about themselves, which actually allows the French to send an army into Mali. That was done on the basis of what they thought about themselves. You could say it's done on the basis of the empire, it's done on the basis of economic interest, but at the end of the day, it was done on the basis of what the French thought they could do. It's a mythology about themselves. It's language, it's imagination, it's reality. So it becomes incredibly important that mythology be directly linked to reality. If you have mythologies which have no relationship to reality, you're in deep, deep trouble. And that is one of the problems of colonialism. People end up with myths which aren't their myths, which don't relate to them, and suddenly they're going to war, they're doing economic policy on the basis of something that actually works for another place. None of this has anything to do with nationalism. It has to do with where are people taking their numbers? How are they constructing the measurements in the equations? Who did the equation? Whose theory of purpose was at the basis of the equation? And if it was coming out of places that had totally different experiences and desires, then probably the language won't work and the myths won't work. And I think that in a sense is the biggest problem that Canada has today, and it's the biggest problem that Canadian intellectuals have today, is making sure that the language running from the universities across the 34 million people, and perhaps elsewhere in the world, actually functions. That we're actually able to describe what we're doing well and badly. And, for me, the perfect example of that is that this is the cutting-edge country when it comes to immigration and citizenship. We're the experimental country in the world. There are all sorts. You can criticize, you can approve, you can say, well, we've gone way, way down on refugees. It's true, and I disapprove. On the other hand, we've still kept the overall numbers up, and there's the part-time laborers coming in, and I disapprove again. But overall, this is the most interesting country in the world, mathematically, statistically, and from point of view of humanity in the world when it comes to experimenting with citizenship, with immigration, with turning immigrants into citizens. And there are philosophical theories behind it. There are about 3 people in Canada capable of enunciating those theories. You know, Gerard Bouchard's pretty good at it, and Will Kimlicka's pretty good at it. There's hardly anybody in Canada who can explain why our immigration and citizenship theories work. They don't even know we've got a theory. So we end up saying we're nice and, you know, we're very relaxed. And I mean, we really don't know what to say. And we end up falling back on essentially European theories, which multiculturalism essentially is, a European theory. It's sort of Austro-Hungarian, late Austro-Hungarian theory. Whereas at least you got to say Gerard Bouchard, you know, really pushed forward the using of a new language, which was interculturalism, which is a far more Canadian, a far better term, which actually functions. And I found myself having a dinner the other night for the Swedish Minister of Immigration, and we were talking about all this, and I said, no, you have to understand, it isn't about little pods of people living side by side, which multiculturalism sounds like. It's much more complicated. It's about a theory of people who are different and the same at the same time, people who have multiple personalities, people who have overlapping civilizations, and they're not, you just have to have confidence that they're loyal. And the government has no right not to have confidence in the loyalty of their citizens. And particularly when there aren't any riots in the streets over this, it seems to be working, right? So there seems to be something happening which we need to be able to describe. And I said, you know, interculturalism is really a far better word than multiculturalism. And he said, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I get that. See, so this comes to my point, which is it isn't that we need to break off in the social science and humanities and do our little thing. It's that in the areas where we're doing something that nobody else is pulling off, we actually have something really interesting to say elsewhere. But we can't say it if we don't know how to say it. If all we're doing is grabbing some of their language and trying to turn that into what we're doing, then we sound like fools. I was on the advisory, it was the oversight panel of the Vanny Bantings until it was done away with recently for utilitarian reasons. And I remember one of the, Banting highest quality applications came in from a European woman, very, very smart. And it was brilliant. She was going to have a look at sort of structures of some sort in Canada. And I looked at it and I realized what she was actually doing was applying Westphalian theory to Canada, which means we were going to come out looking really, really bad. You know, it doesn't work in theory. And I pointed that out to everybody. Everybody said, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the end, she was accepted, but they were going to talk to her very seriously about her basic theories. You know. So there's a sort of there's an element of self-confidence which is required here in order to establish in the humanities and social sciences the kind of academic public language which will work here and elsewhere. And I don't think that we should hesitate for 1 second, before this growing problem, which is the problem of, you know, I know this organization doesn't accept this problem, but this idea that really serious academics are not popular. That, you know, if you do something as an academic which is popular, then you somehow demean to some extent your standing as an academic. This is a terribly self-destructive viewpoint, terribly self-destructive. And I mean, there are many, many stories of young academics whose careers have been damaged because they dared to write something that could be read by a large number of people and were successful, and they were looked down upon by their colleagues. This is totally unacceptable, particularly in a country where we're doing certain things which other people aren't doing. And therefore we need to have the kind of public debate, highly intellectually led public debate, which I think universities did a great deal in other countries in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century. We can't afford to turn inwards when we're doing so many things which simply are not typical. And I mean, you're talking to somebody who spends has spent a lot of his time outside the country. I spend 70% of my time traveling as president of PEN. And, of course, there are moments, the moment comes when people say, yes, now we've talked about the horrible prison situation here now, and they start asking questions about Canada. You have to be able to explain it, and they don't understand what we're doing. I mean, I've sat in Germany day after day after day, in France, in England. They simply don't understand what we're doing intellectually. So we are failing. We have failed to explain what it is we're doing. And I think that, I don't know if everybody understands French. That's why I'm going on and on in English. Les francophones savent que je serais content de faire tout ça en français, mais je ne sais pas si ça va passer. Does everybody understand French? Yes? OK. Moi, je crois que ce serait très intéressant ici de... Et encore une fois, ça revient à cette question de quels sont des niveaux de qualité internationale. De vraiment regarder les structures universitaires internationales, occidentales, et se poser la question, est-ce que ces structures marchent pour nous, surtout dans les humanités et les sciences sociales? Pourquoi? Je vous donne quelques exemples. Enseignement de littérature français est fait avec un début en France, et puis lentement, à la fin des cours, si vous faites 4 ans, vous arrivez brièvement à la fin dans les provinces, dans les colonies. Et on parle un peu de littérature québécoise, ou peut-être on parlerait des Acadiens, peut-être on parlera un peu d'Afrique du Nord, surtout si c'est les Africains du Nord qui écrivent comme à Paris. Hein. Et tout ça, c'est fait, c'est linéaire. Et puis, trois salles plus loin, on est en train d'enseigner English literature. You know, Old English, and then Old English, and then English, and then, you know, after we've gone through all the stuff the English did, and then we'll get to the United States, you know, and then finally, somewhere way down the road, if you persist, there'll be, you know, the colonies. There'll be Australia and Canada and whatever, and nowhere in the way in which the universities teach either of these things, French literature and English literature, is there a suggestion that we live in a country which has both of these literatures? Nowhere. I mean, maybe you can point out some place where there's one course. I know they're gradually doing away with most of them, actually. But I don't know of one place where you know, the fact that, and I'll make this up, that Leonard Cohen lived next door to Gilles Vigneault in Montreal, which they don't, but I mean, they know each other, right? And had coffee every morning, or that Mordecai Richler lived next to Gilles Vigneault. Nowhere is there an intellectual construct in the universities for saying, well, what happens if you put all that together? How does that work? What does that produce? We don't do that because that is not world class. That is not the way it's done. It's done English stream, French stream. It's a reconstruction of the French Empire and the British Empire with the intervention of the United States and the English stream. Is this useful to our country? Is this actually intellectually sound from a Canadian point of view? Are we really saying that the Francophones, I'm not being federalist here. You can be I don't care whether you're a separatist or a sovereignist or a nationalist, I don't care. The point is, are we really saying that there is no relationship intellectually between the two languages when it comes to literature? Is that what we're saying? Because that's what we're teaching, right? And I'm finding more and more historians who actually aren't completely bilingual. I don't know how you can be an historian of Canada if you're not completely bilingual. For a start, reading. Most of the texts are in the two languages. But you just can't have the conversation without being completely bilingual. You're actually removing a quarter of the population, which historically has been a half to a third of the population. It means that then history is taught cut off from reality. And of course, philosophy, I said this a number of times already, I think the philosophy departments need to be blown up. And then put back and then all the pieces gathered up, and a whole bunch of other pieces brought in and put back together in a completely different way. I mean, we're teaching philosophy, and I know how philosophy is taught. And there are little variations, and where there's the Paris school, you know, in the French, and then there's the Anglo-American school in English. And there are these choices that are made, where Vico isn't included because you belong to a part of the English school, and so is included because you're in the French tradition. And it is perfectly clear when you take philosophy in Canada that even though we've been, as a kind of immigration, Aboriginal immigration country, we've been at it for 4 centuries. We haven't had a single original idea in 4 centuries. That's the way we teach philosophy. Not one idea has come out of Canada. And that's why people like McLuhan are marginalized, and people like Innes are marginalized. And I think it's probably why Charles Taylor was pushed out of philosophy into political science, and I think it's why the philosophy department at U of T demoted French, because it's very dominated by kind of the American school, which is the English school with an American input. And they couldn't figure out why anybody would be speaking this strange other language, because you don't need to do that in the United States, right? So philosophy clearly has to be seriously rethought if you're going to live in a country which does not meet the requirements of Immanuel Kant or Descartes or any other Central European philosopher. And it doesn't. What we're doing is in contradiction with the tradition of European philosophy. That's why, Germany has managed to become a federation after the death of 100 million Europeans in one half of the 20th century, right? And, Italy doesn't quite function as a federation. And the dominant people, the British and the French, have absolutely no idea what we're talking about when we talk about federalism, even though England supposedly is one, but it doesn't function that way at all. So there's an enormous need to say, what would philosophy look like? Maybe this is where, again, we should be in the export business. See, there I'm joining with you. We should be in the export business in philosophy because they're having a terrible time in Europe. They're falling back into the worst of the 19th century because they can't escape from the Westphalian nation-state, monolithic nation-state, racially based, which they call culture, ideas of how to run a nation-state and how to put Europe together. As soon as they hit some problems, they started going backwards, right? And they're having riots again, and they've got all these problems about citizenship. And we're actually in a very interesting position to be turning to the Europeans and saying, well, we have a completely different approach, which includes your thinkers, but it also includes a whole bunch of other thinkers who come from here. And some of them would be people like Kimlicka and Bouchard, and some of you, no doubt. And a whole group of them would probably be Aboriginal. I mean, people like, Sankaj Henderson, one of the most original legal philosophers in Canada, and I would say in the world. Or Leroy Littlebear, who some of you probably know in Lethbridge, or Richard Atleo, who's in Winnipeg. It was actually the father of the National Chief. I mean, his 2 books of philosophy, which are based on Housat philosophy, make much more sense for Canada than Immanuel Kant does, I can tell you. It actually sounds familiar when I read it. It actually sounds like the kind of place we live in, whereas I read, the Europeans, and it doesn't sound like this country. So here we've got all these kids doing PhDs, footnoted out of their minds, but it's not actually about who they are or where they're from. And it's certainly nothing that they can take abroad. It's a little bit like the National Ballet taking Swan Lake to London, And people say, aren't they sweet? Isn't that nice? They do it quite well, right? Did you get it, what I'm saying? So, you do Immanuel Kant. Oh, that far away you do it. How interesting. As opposed to coming and saying, look, you got some real problems here. And the reason you have problems is because the structure of your theory doesn't work for what you need to do today in the post-Second World War world. And we have some theories which actually are quite different and could be very helpful to you. And so what does this look like in practical terms? And I'll be very sort of low here. We're sitting in Ottawa. I say this every time I give a speech in Ottawa. It doesn't matter who the audience is. It is taught in universities and schools around Canada, and it is believed by the Canadian government and the civil service and the NCC, those of you who aren't from Ottawa, National Capital Commission, that Ottawa was chosen as Canada's capital by Queen Victoria, right? Completely untrue. It's a myth. Completely and utterly untrue. Ottawa was chosen by John A. Macdonald, Georges Etienne Cartier, and the Governor General of the day, who understood Canada pretty well. And they put together the most fabulously Baroque campaign because it was so corrupt, Canadian politics, that couldn't get Parliament to vote a majority on what the capital would be. So they decided it would be Ottawa for very good reasons, about 5 or 6 reasons. And then they set up a competition between the 5 major cities. And everybody, Toronto, Kingston, Montreal, Toronto, Quebec City. And everybody put in their, the most interesting photographs of Toronto from the earliest big range of photographs of Toronto is from the early 1850s, were done for the competition. But of course, it was completely fixed. This competition was put together when they had all the plans in a way that made it clear that Ottawa was the choice. And then the Governor-General was sent to London to see, responsible government, to see the British government, to instruct the British government on behalf of the Canadian government for whom he worked as the Governor-General under responsible government, to instruct Queen Victoria to choose Ottawa, which she duly did, having no idea where it was. And they brought it back and put it to Parliament, which was totally corrupt, and they still turned it down. So then there was the double shuffle, which the historians in the room know, the Canadian historians anyway. And Macdonald resigned. Cartier came in. He took a lot of public money and purchased a number of votes from sitting members of Parliament. I forget how many. Antonio, do you know how many it was? It was like 10 votes or 8 votes or something. I know, but I don't remember how much they cost, but it was public money. And went back and voted Ottawa in. So even with Queen Victoria acting as a kind of shield, it still had to be the choice of the Parliament. And we're going around teaching that dear Queen Victoria chose our capital for us, which, of course, from a mythological point of view, means that we were so inferior as people, so insecure, so nothing socially and culturally, that we had to get this lady who'd never bothered to come here. She went to a lot of other places, never bothered to come here, to get her to choose from among places she didn't know, one of the places she'd probably never even heard of. I mean, can you think of anything more colonially insulting than to go on insisting that she is the one who chose Ottawa? I mean, it's an interesting story because it's a story about not getting your mythology right and the effect that it has on the way people think about Ottawa, which is it's not meant to be the capital. The basis of the idea that Ottawa is an artificial capital is this story about Queen Victoria, when it's completely untrue. It was chosen because it was very close to where the fortune of Canada was coming from, the wood coming down the river, far away from the American border, had double communications routes, pure Innis stuff, and was very beautiful, and was on the Francophone-Anglophone border. So it was the perfect capital. It was very cleverly done, and if we thought about it that way, we'd like it more. This is where language and mythology, we could learn how to like it more. How's that? We could criticize it for the right things, And I'll give you another example. And you say, well, these are not intellectual things. These are just cliches. I'm sorry, this is what Canadians think. Canada was formed in the blood of the First World War battlefields, and particularly at Vimy. Now, I come from an army family, right? My father landed on D-Day, etc. So I'm not anti-army. But, of course, when you think about it, that concept that a nation-state can only be formed on the battlefield is a pure European, Westphalian nation-state concept of how you do it. It's about power and blood. And, of course, it's about race, because it's the shedding of the pure blood of the people, both of whom are superior to each other, which is why they're killing each other, right? I mean, we got sort of 700 years of that. And I think that probably the reality is that, much of what Canadians think about themselves from an historic and a literary and philosophical point of view comes from the fact that in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was an enormous wave of Protestant Northern Irish, people like my family, and English, who came under the umbrella of the empire. We have no idea today, the historians do, but I mean, people talk about globalization and, you can't do anything if it's against globalization. Well, globalization is a sort of marginal country cousin compared to the influence and power of the 5 empires up until 1914. I mean, We put our napkins on the left because Queen Victoria was left-handed. Tables are set according to the way they were set. I mean, the whole thing, the influence of the empire myth was enormous in the late 19th century. And this large number of people who, in a sense, advanced their own careers in Canada by coming under the umbrella of the British Empire, had an incredible impact. And they were the people who put in place the universities. Look at when the universities are formed. Look at how they're formed. Look at who they brought in as the original teachers from, sort of second and third rate people from Britain and second and third rate people from France. I mean, and they came in with all these empire ideas of how do you organize a university? Well, you do it the way we did it at home. Well, what do you teach? Well, you teach what we taught at home. Who's superior here? Well, where I come from is superior. And they created this myth of Canada, which actually has very little to do with who we are and how we function. And it's getting more and more problematic for the country to be stuck with this approach and with these mythologies. And frankly, there were here Aboriginals and Francophones and a large black population and a very large German population. The Loyalists, biggest group in the Loyalists was German, not often talked about. And of course, by the late 19th century, a lot of people from Central and Northern Europe, and they felt very comfortable as Canadians. You go back, historians go and look at the texts. They didn't feel themselves to be colonial. They saw themselves as being in a country. But the people who came at the end of the century saw themselves as being very dependent upon the intellectual mythology from these other places. And therefore, they needed the First World War to free them from that sense of dependency. Right? And they had to get angry with Britain because of the way Canadian soldiers were treated. So they believed that blood was the thing that made us free. But they still weren't actually free because they still didn't really understand about Aboriginals and Francophones and Germans and blacks. And, they were still in this world of the European nation state. And the revelation for them was still a European-style revelation. Gradually, it's worked out. Gradually, I don't think one can say that about any group in Canada. People have come to feel that it is the sort of place it is. But we still don't have the language and the identification with the mythologies and the history that we need. That's why I'm always banging on and on and on about Le Pays de Montréal and the Niagara Peace and La Fontaine and Baldwin and all of these things, which are actually the intellectual and political and practical foundations of what we do. That's why, when I wrote Siamese Twins, I said we can't go on saying we're two founding people in multiculturalism. We have to start saying we have a triangular foundation of Aboriginal, Francophone, and Anglophone. And people were ready. It took about 2 weeks, and every politician in Ottawa was using it because they said, this sounds right. This is where intellectual language functions. You get it right, people pick it up. And, I remember in that book I said, the thing about Canada is it's completely unlike a European country because essentially Canada, its essential nature is it's very, very complicated. And what we're trying to do is not make it simple. We're trying to figure out how to live with complexity. That's what makes this interesting is how do you live with complexity? Immigration and citizenship policies, living with complexity. Completely the opposite of what the British and the French and the Germans are struggling with because they don't understand that idea that complexity is a good way to think about citizenship. They spent all those years in removing complexity in order to have a citizenship they could identify with. In spite of all that, it is very difficult to row against this idea that there is an international model. I mean, I'll give you a little example. Probably the big breakpoint in Canada was not Vimy. Probably the real breakpoint in modern Canada was the summer of 1848, which was the high point of the Irish famine. And you go through the preceding 5 years, and there was a British emigration policy, and there was no Canadian immigration policy. And the British just, sent these people on slave ships. The conditions were equal to slave ships. Cholera, everything, dying to arrive in Quebec City and Montreal, and then they were put on ships below or above the rapids so that they could be brought to Toronto, where they were then sent off to farms. But actually the family compact who was in power and therefore let the contracts out to their friends. And the ships going from Montreal to Toronto were worse than the ships going across the Atlantic. The conditions were actually worse. But the interesting thing about this is the arrival in Montreal and then the arrival in Toronto of these people dying, miserable, mistreated, endangering the local population and themselves, a horror, an embarrassment to all of us. Well, this was the thing that broke the emotional link between the Anglophones who were there and Britain. That was the end. Because up till then it was all, the Queen and the government and the British, and we were with them sort of thing. And then suddenly they saw that these people could dump, I think it's 4 times the population of Toronto arrived in the space of 3 months in Toronto. Sick people, dying people, on us with no sense of responsibility, including Palmerston, foreign minister, emptying his own lands and sending them to Canada. And you look at the exchanges back and forth, very, very angry, where Elgin, the very interesting Governor-General, is having to deal with, I think it's his brother-in-law who's the minister responsible, and explaining this just simply is totally unacceptable. Anyway, the first 2 things happened out of that summer. The first was that what's known as the responsible government election of January 1849. I got my dates wrong, 47? 48. So it's the summer of 47, and the election is January 48. Is always thought of as the responsible government election. There was always a majority in Quebec, but there wasn't a majority in Upper Canada, right? And suddenly there was a majority in Upper Canada, and people say, finally Baldwin won, democracy won. Yes, but the thing that turned the election was the horror of every reasonable Upper Canadian when they looked at the Irish, what had been done to the Irish. Absolute horror. And the first thing the government did, before it became the government, this is interesting, they had the majority, before they even took power, was they used a committee and they wrote a bill, the first immigration bill. So the first act of the first Canadian Democratic government was to write an immigration bill, which is a fascinating bill. And Elgin was instructed to write London, to tell London that we were no longer going to be subject to their immigration policy and that we would have an immigration policy. This was probably the turning point in the creation of modern Canada. It's really, really interesting. This would really help Canadians understand why it is that we do the kinds of things that we do today at our best. So, this was the introduction, by the way. My introductions are usually longer than my speeches. So where are we today? What's happening today? Well, I wrote this book, A Fair Country, and I thought, well, I'll just find out on the first page, so I think it opens by saying we're a Métis civilization. I thought, well, that'll either be the end of my career or we'll just see what happens. And to my astonishment, people just said, that's us. I mean, middle-aged Celtic men come up to me in the streets within a week and start going, Saul, you're absolutely right, we're a Métis people. This is amazing, because in their minds, mythologically speaking, they've finally got their stories straight. They know how to talk about themselves. They know how the history works. Of course, there are all the raw spots and all the things we did wrong, but they have a way of thinking about themselves. And the second thing was, I thought when I said that Canada was a country, a civilization, owing more on its positive side to Aboriginals than it did to Europeans, I thought there'd be quite a little fuss. And I was really astonished to see that people thought, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds, you just explain it a little bit. You say, well, 400 years, 250 years, Aboriginals were either dominant or they were partners. And further north you go, the longer the Aboriginal influence lasted. The Inuit were more or less in charge until after the Second World War. I mean, they only had to put up with our brilliance for a couple of decades before they got free of us, before we ruined them completely. People sort of say, yeah, there's something in all of this. There's something very, very interesting. And I think that the task, and it's interesting because of what happened in this town across the country at the end of last year, beginning of the new year, is that was not an accident. That's a sign of where we are. If you look at this from 1900 on, this is a very important moment in the history of modern Canada. And if we can succeed at reestablishing the role of Aboriginals in how we see the creation of this civilization, we'll have done something really, really important. We'll have actually moved this country into a new kind of emotional, intellectual, fact-based measurement territory where we can say, oh yeah, no. The reason we do it this way is because we have a different tradition. It's not a better tradition. It doesn't make us better. It's not like the old French, English, German thing. That it's a tradition where the circumstances meant that we had to do it differently, that the Europeans came, they were lost, they were miserable, they were uneducated, they had no way to do anything. The Aboriginals took them into their circle, if you like, into their families. And they worked out this idea, well, you come in the circle and then we'll figure out how we're going to get on together. Canadian immigration policy, right? In the 16th century, in the 17th century. And we put this thing together. If we can start talking about ourselves, which is dependent entirely on you, in a way which actually builds all of that into the way we learn about history, the way we learn about literature, the way we learn about philosophy, then you will find that Canadians will be much more comfortable with themselves and much better able to talk about themselves, including you, when you go to those international meetings and the guy from Harvard stands up and says, well, here, Ms. Nussbaum stands up and says, here are the international structures. And you say, actually, that's Chicago you're talking about? That's not international? And actually, you're not doing very well with it. And we have another theory. Now, we're not saying you should adopt our theory, but here's how our theory works. You might want to think about that. And it would be a great victory for the way in which we imagine ourselves. It doesn't mean that, separatists will stop being separatists or sovereignists will start being sovereignists and that Aboriginals will suddenly say, oh, everything's fabulous here. That's not what it means. What it means is we would have taken a very important step in figuring out how we live together and therefore maybe how we could live together a bit better in the future, intellectually and in reality, and how we would talk to each other about how we live together, intellectually, mythologically, with our imaginations, and therefore how we would do business together, how we would do science together, how we would do politics together. So what I'm saying is very simple. 400 years ago, according to the universities, there were 2 million people in this area that's more or less Canada, Aboriginals. That number stood up until somewhere in the second half of the 19th century when it collapsed for all the reasons you know. By the early 20th century, there were 150,000, according to you. And at that point, at the beginning of the 20th century, people who looked like me decided that the Aboriginals were finished because through Darwinian determinism, it was clear they were a weak civilization, they were on their way out. And of course, Métis were even weaker because they had weakened blood. I mean, those of you who've read the text, that's what the texts actually say. There were arguments between Francophones and Anglophones about who had the purest blood and who had the weakest blood because of the intermarriages and so on. Really, if it weren't serious, it would be so comic. And at that point, the Canadian government and the provincial governments and the intellectuals in Canada, mainly from Europe, decided the Aboriginals were finished. They wrote them out of history. History was all about England and France and the United States, and we're this little place, and we're going to help these people disappear by, residential schools, make them into sort of decent white people, right? And get rid of those weak civilizations. But when you actually look at the texts of the Aboriginals, you see that at that very low point, the lowest point, 2 million to 150,000 in a half century, more or less, you see them planning their comeback. It's absolutely fabulous. You read the texts, which are not taught in our universities or schools. The letter from the chiefs of British Columbia presented to Sir Wilfrid Laurier on the famous trip that Wilfrid Laurier did in 1910 across the country. I don't know, how long did it go on? Does somebody know? Are there any PhDs on that trip? Because that trip set the direction of Canada for 100 years. There should be. I would certainly sit on a jury for PhDs on that subject. It's an amazing story of how everybody got organized and together. What became the NDP, the CCF, the farmers' movements, all got organized as a result of the great man coming across the country and stopping in every single town. They all came to the train and presented petitions. So, just out of Kamloops, the chiefs of British Columbia presented a letter. He came down, he spent a day with them, and he presented this incredibly beautiful letter about the relationship between First Nations people and the Europeans. Not a pretty picture for Anglophones, much better for Francophones. It says something like the real Canadians, those are the Francophones, as opposed to the Anglophones who came and were brutal and unpleasant. It's very interesting to read this. That's 1910. They're still at about 150,000. Today, they're at 1.2 million. They're on their way to 1.5 million. They're soon going to be 2 million. It's one of the most astonishing comebacks in history. That century, if you look at the Royal Commission report, all its documents, is filled with the stories, with the documents, with the presentations, with the demands, with the negotiations. It's all there on paper. And the fascinating thing is that as of about 40 years ago, they started going to the courts. You know, when they started getting organized, we tried to ban it, and then we banned them from hiring lawyers. And then they got past that after the Second World War, and they started hiring lawyers. And then about 40 years ago, they started sending kids to law school. Why to law school? Because we broke the treaties through the law. So they thought the only way to beat the federal government, the provincial governments, and the corporations is through the law. Today, there are over 2,000 Aboriginal lawyers. There are over 30 Aboriginal judges. And they haven't lost a case at the Supreme Court in 4 decades. And in this year already, they've won 2 major cases, including the fantastic Manitoba Métis case, which has been basically running since Louis Riel. Not technically, but in reality, when Orange Order people broke the agreement on the script over land with the Manitoba Métis. So you have this astonishing comeback happening. You have the Guérin victory on the honor of the Crown. The Crown is the people of Canada. That's who the Crown is. The Crown is the abstract representation of the people of Canada, of the authority of the people of Canada. And some civil servants broke the rules regarding an Aboriginal nation south of Vancouver. They eventually went to court. The Chief Guérin, elected chief, told me he had to steal the relevant piece of paper because the federal government representative says you had no right to see these pieces of paper, which were the pieces of paper in which they cheated them out of the land. Anyway, he stole it. He a little grin on his face, and he's a very smart man. They then ended up in the Supreme Court and won, and what they won was what the Supreme Court called the obligation of the Crown to act with honor, which is to act for the well-being of the people. And what's fascinating is that this decision, which is cited in the Manitoba Métis case, is thought of as a kind of Aboriginal decision. But this is my point about us. I don't know if there are any Aboriginal in the audience, but that many of these astonishing victories at the Supreme Court of Aboriginal people are victories for all of us. Any one of you could go to the courts and invoke the honor of the Crown on the basis of Guérin and now the Métis decision. Because it isn't just that the Crown has an obligation to act with honor vis-a-vis the Aboriginals. They have an obligation to act with honor vis-a-vis Canadian citizens. And nobody's sort of, this is what about thinking about ourselves differently. It's an intellectual problem. It's a mythological problem. We could be going on public school issues and invoking the honor of the Crown. Healthcare issues. Justice issues. Thanks to the First Nations who are making the big breakthroughs in the court. Not us. They're making the breakthroughs. Delgamut, this astonishing victory in which the Crown came forward with the written texts. I don't know how many of you know it. It's the single most important decision made by the Supreme Court in the last 50 years. Period. Right? And the Crown came with the written treaty and said to the court, here's the treaty. Here are the signatures. Here are the notations. Here's the next year. Here's an acceptance of money. Here's the proof, written proof. And I won't, this is an inaccurate explanation I'm giving. And then the representatives of the First Nations stood up and said, more or less, this is not exactly how it happened, but more or less said, here's so-and-so who is the 3rd or 4th generation descendant of the firekeeper, of the person responsible for the memory of the people who signed the treaty. He will now explain to you what happened that day. And I don't know, it's sort of 5 or 6 hours later, after he described every single detail, because oral memory is more exact than written memory and can't be screwed around with in the same way, right? Because with written stuff, you can just a comma here and you can do things. With oral, it's a very exact memory. I mean, people have written about the exactness of oral memory before the written era. And the Supreme Court, in a decision written by the head of the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of oral memory over written memory. That is one of the most exciting. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, here you are worrying about European university traditions. Our Supreme Court voted, and I think it was unanimous, so I can't remember, voted that oral memory could be more accurate than written memory. This is a very exciting and troubling decision for you, for all those kids doing PhDs with footnotes. Because the Supreme Court just said, well, the footnotes are all very well, but what about, you know? I'm going to finish in one second. The Haida decision on consultation, again, could be used by everybody. And you'll see that the National Chief today complained that in the budget, the federal government put forward a program which was not the result of consulting. They're just imposing the program. It's a very interesting decision. What we're seeing at the moment is Canadian governments are simply trying to ignore the Supreme Court. They're trying to pretend it isn't happening, but eventually they will have to. And I'm not attacking the Conservatives. Liberals are no better. The provincial governments are no better. They're all trying to pretend that Canadian history is not being reestablished in its justice by the Supreme Court. This is very, very exciting. And those of you who are from the West will know that there's a public phrase, a mythological phrase, which is often used in meetings of all sorts, where somebody says, who are the treaty people? How many of you have heard this? You have. How many of you have heard it? I know you don't like putting your hands, you're not students, but, you know, and the answer is we are the treaty people because treaties are signed by both sides. If the Aboriginals are held to the fact that they gave up their land in some way, we are held to the fact that we made promises. We are equally held. I am a treaty person. And when I speak at immigration citizenship ceremonies, I say to people, even if you arrived yesterday in this country, you're a treaty person. You are bound by the treaties that we have with the Aboriginal people. And that's very exciting for you. Very exciting. And people look very pleased because it's a really interesting way of thinking about the country, an intellectual and mythological way of thinking about it. So these dramas of the last 4 months with Idle No More and the meetings and who would go to the meetings and who wouldn't go to the meetings and was the National Chief in trouble, and you'd see things like this attempt to apply Western European analysis to what was going on, the Parliament Hill journalist version of Western theory. That's a joke. And they would say, oh, well, Chief so-and-so, who yesterday sat in a press conference with the National Chief, has just said he won't go to the meeting with the Prime Minister, and therefore the National Chief is cut off, etc. And then the next day, there's this chief sitting next to the National Chief again, and they go and they say, Chief, yesterday you broke with the National Chief. I said, no, I didn't. I just said I wouldn't go to the meeting. So they're not trying to listen to how public debate and negotiation takes place in the world of Aboriginals, which has deeply influenced the way we do federal-provincial negotiations in Canada. It isn't about he walked out of the room. Yeah, he walked out of the room, but he's going to be back in 10 minutes or tomorrow, and then we'll start over again. And, you know, it's endless, it's ineffective, it's inefficient, and the result of that is we're the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. And while we were wasting time ineffectively debating in this peculiar, basically Aboriginal way, all our friends and neighbors were fighting civil wars and having coups d'etats. Right? So in other words, there's a philosophical theory here, which is really interesting, which is not coming out of our universities, which is not being ingested by our kids, as a way to make them understand that what we're doing on purpose. So all of this to say, I think that it's time, and I'm taking a step further from what you said a little earlier, I think it's time for us to rethink very seriously the structures of our universities, in particular in the social sciences and the humanities, to take seriously not that we're better, but that our experience is very peculiar. It's very particular. It's all about this place, which is way up in the north. It's got the longest coastline in the world. There's some geography people, I mean, you know, having the longest coastline in the world means something. We only have one border with one country. We're very isolated through most of our history and very rough country. The Europeans were very dependent on the people that came here. As I said, and I won't take the time to do it at length, but, you know, the creation of the Métis people was the result of poor, uneducated Europeans marrying up by marrying Aboriginal. Right? These kids from some island in northern Scotland, you know, are picked up by the boats, brought to Canada, and they're told, listen, they have no money, They hardly speak English because they're Scots. You know, it's 18th, 19th century. They have no contacts, they have no land, they have nothing. And they said, listen, if you can, marry the daughter of a chief. Why? Because she'll speak 5 languages, she's educated. She'll know about how to get through the winter with food. She'll know about clothing and house, survival. And you'll be marrying into a military and economic alliance across the country, which is both safety and money. It's called marrying up. It's very simple. And then you understand the country differently once you know that. So what I'm saying is that the moment has come to think about the storyline, to think about the mythology, to think about the language, to think about the way we're doing our PhDs, about what is it that interests us in our PhDs. The very fact that nobody could throw up their hands and say there were already 250 PhDs on Laurier's trip across Canada, one of the most interesting political events of North America, of the Americas, of the 19th and 20th century, is a very revealing fact. Because it was this moment when the greatest politician, one of the 2 greatest politicians of post-Confederation period, simply put himself into the hands of the people for months, from town to town to town and town. And they organized themselves to explain how they thought the country should be. And that is, to a large extent, what the country became. It's a very, very interesting thing, and I hope you'll take me seriously. I think that throws into question our approaches towards European and American methods, our approaches towards specialization, certainly in the humanities and the social sciences. We have to rethink what those specializations look like, putting French and English literature together in various ways, bringing in Aboriginal literature, putting Aboriginal philosophy into the philosophy department along with other things. You go into these courses of, what do you call it, great books courses in various universities across Canada, and I've gone and spoken at them. I say, so tell me, you do Confucius? Oh, we don't have time for Confucius. There's so many books in Europe. Well, you do Islam, right? Well, they'll get to that afterwards. And of course, they don't do Aboriginal. I mean, this is so old-fashioned, so out of touch with the reality of the kind of country that it is. The country really is. So all I'm saying is, the big question for the humanities and the social sciences is that these departments must not allow themselves to slip any further towards utilitarianism, training, measurement, business school approaches, management school approaches. These are suicidal. A professor said to me beforehand, we're being encouraged to call ourselves professionals. You're not professionals, you're intellectuals. It's the exact opposite. It is the precise opposite. A professional is an employee who sort of does something. You don't do something, you think, and you make other people think. That's not a profession. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Professions are fine, but you are doing something which is far more wonderful. You have an opportunity to do this kind of rethinking, to make these kind of leaps. And, you say, well, we're under pressure. The social sciences and the humanities are under pressure because of the business schools and the economic schools and the management schools and the utilitarianism and the measurement and the utility. The whole history of this country shows that the people who do the most interesting thing come from the endangered minorities. It's the story of the Francophones. It's the story of the Aboriginals. It's the story of minorities across this country. Now that you are in an endangered position, I encourage you to start taking intellectual risks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, it was too long.